the weight of water. The first thing Evan Pike learned about helicopters was that they never really landed, they only gave up on flying for a while. The second was that the sea did not care what you thought you were capable of. Both rules were delivered by Mark Hawk Hawkins, senior winchman at Newquay's HM Coast Guard helicopter base, a man with salt in his voice and patience rationed like fuel. "Truth of it," Hawk said on Evan's first day, leaning back in the crew room chair, boots crossed, "is that the sea is old and we are visitors. Respect gets you home, bravado gets you headlines and funerals." Evan tried to look unafraid. He had spent 5 years on mountain rescue, had a paramedic's registration, and could run a rope system in the dark with his gloves on. But the helicopter smelled of hydraulic fluid and hot metal, and the Atlantic beyond the runway was a heavy iron blue that looked like it ate men. He hid his hands by the mug of tea Hawk had made for him, which was scalding and strong enough to stand a spoon. Hawk's eyes were quick, then kind. "Good. You're listening." That night, the wind swung into the west. The radar painted veils of weather across the coast, and Evan lay awake in the crew quarters, memorizing the route to the aircraft, the feel of his harness buckles, the order of checks. In the adjacent room, someone snored. On the far side of the airfield, gulls bickered like drunks outside a chip shop. He found the blankness before sleep, and as it often did when he was anxious, the past slid in. The Moreland call he hadn't made in time, the patient who had looked at him and known he was young. At 3:41, the phone rang. The call came as a shout from the ops room, and then the base lit itself like a ship, everyone moving with a speed that wasn't panic. Evan ran with the others beneath sodium lamps and low cloud. The S-92, a hulking orange shape, hunched on its pad. "On the way," Hawk said, conversational as if in a supermarket aisle. "Fishing boat, 3 miles west of St. Ives, 1 crewman injured, 1 seasick, both too battered to make harbor. We'll winch, treat, and escort them home. You're with me. Stay on my shoulder until I tell you different." "Yes, boss." In the aircraft, the rotors flowered, then found their rhythm. The roar was a physical thing in Evan's chest, a hand that pressed and lifted, the air salty in the vents. Pilot and co-pilot talked in that measured tone which makes you trust people. The winch operator did his ballet with the cable and the hook, and Hawk clipped Evan's lanyard to the deck with a metallic kiss. A red light painted everything brittle and important. Hawk's gloved hand settled on Evan's shoulder, a weight and an anchor. "Breathe," he said, mouth close to Evan's ear. "Count to 4 on the way in, 4 on the way out. It makes you look clever." Evan smiled despite the fear. "And if I lose count?" "Start again. No one's keeping score." The sea swung up to meet them, the fishing boat small and stubborn below, its mast light blinking like a heartbeat. Hawk went first, a dark figure against darker water. Then the winch took Evan, and he tried not to flinch when his feet left the metal he trusted. Cold slapped him even inside the suit. The boat pitched, and he timed the last meter like they'd taught him, eyes on the deckhands, knees soft, 1 hand for the boat, 1 for himself. His boots hit with a thud. A fisherman shouted in Cornish, relief and exhaustion in equal measure. They made the deck safe, unclipped, moved inside. The injured crewman had a laceration to his scalp and the terrified stiffness of someone who had seen a wave bigger than he thought possible. Evan cleaned, closed, dressed, spoke gently. He worked while feeling the boat's living movement under his feet, the way a deck doesn't ever settle. Hawk checked the winch line, and the pilot's voice drifted down from the helicopter like a god's aside. 60 seconds, gentlemen. Weather closing." Hawk gave Evan a look that meant decide. Evan nodded, bandage secured, patient stable enough for a lift. They sent him up, then the seasick one. Then Hawk put a hand on Evan's chest and said, "Your turn." "After you." Hawk's eyes creased at the corners. "We'll get along." They were back on the pad by dawn, the sea under lead skies, and the base smelled of bacon, wet neoprene, and victory. In the crew room, the kettle fought itself to a boil. Someone had left a note on the whiteboard in neat black pen. "Bake sale Thursday, bring cash and appetite." Hawk peeled his suit down to his waist, steam rising from him, skin flushed red. "You did all right," he said. "Thanks." "You count?" "4 in, 4 out," Evan said. "Lost count once." "Start again," Hawk said, and smiled for real this time. Evan met Asha Verma 3 days later in the A&E at Royal Cornwall Hospital after a day of drills. She was a registrar with a calm that was not learned, a way of looking at patients that made them feel like she had time. The nursing staff deferred to her with a glance rather than a question. She wore her hair tied back, had faint circles under her eyes like the print of rings left on paper. Evan was delivering a casualty from a cliff fall, a teenager who had thought the earth was his friend. They brought him in fast, vitals holding. Asha met them at the doors. She did not smile until the boys' numbers settled. Then she did, and it lit the room. Afterward, with their patient admitted, Evan and Hawk stood at the coffee machine, which pretended not to be terrible. "Thanks for the handover," Asha said, coming over with a file tucked under her elbow. "Good work on the analgesia. Saved us a fight." "Paramedic's instinct," Evan said, then winced at how that sounded. "By which I mean training." She laughed softly. "It works either way." Hawk watched them with a look that was not exactly teasing and not exactly protective. "Doc," he said, "this is Evan. He thinks helicopters land." Asha raised an eyebrow. "Do they not?" "They relent," Hawk said, and wandered away to examine an out-of-date notice about flu jabs. "Does he always talk like that?" Asha asked. "Only when he likes someone," Evan said, then blushed at his own mouth. "I mean, respects. He respects you." "Good to know," she said, amused. "I'm Asha." "Evan," he said, though she already knew, "do you ever sleep?" "Sometimes when I'm waiting for the kettle," she said, and picked up her file again. "Bring me more patients I can help. I'll owe you a coffee that tastes of actual coffee." It took 3 more hospital visits, a shared sandwich in a corridor, and a quiet midnight where a fisherman's widow sat alone, before Asha took Evan up on that coffee. They met in a cafe where the glass fogged with the breath of people, and the hiss of milk steaming was a heartbeat. Outside, the sky was coastal grey. Inside, Asha curled both hands around her cup as if it were a small stove. "You live near the harbour?" she asked. "Penzance," he said. "Small flat. View of a car park if I lean out of the window and risk death." She laughed. "I'm in Truro with a housemate. We time our days off like eclipses." They talked about work in the way people do when they know their work is the framework of their days. Evan told her about his training, about rope and rotor wash, about the first time he had climbed a winch cable, and felt very aware of his own unremarkable weight. Asha told him about the rituals of shift handover, about the strange intimacy of knowing strangers' blood results. "Do you ever think about leaving?" she asked at last. Evan looked at his hands. "Sometimes, when I've had a bad one. Mountain rescue wasn't easier, but the ground stayed in one place. Then there's a moment, and you remember why you're here. You, I once tried to imagine a life where everything was planned and clean, she said. My brain rejected it. He remembered the teenager, the way she'd smoothed the boy's hair back from his forehead without looking like she was doing it. He remembered Hawk's hand on his shoulder. He tried not to think about the sea, like a door he had opened. He looked up, and Asha was watching him with that same not-learned calm. Dinner, he said, surprising himself. When our eclipses coincide. Deal, she said, and they both grinned like children at a gate. The base ran on calls and drills, on maintenance and tea. Evan learned the weight of the litter in different winds, the temper of cable and hook, the voice of the winch operator when you were out of line. He learned to listen to Hawk's silences, which spoke louder than his jokes. He learned that the sea taught modesty, that people in trouble often told you about their dog before their own injuries, that fear comes in bright colors and dull ones. Hawk did not talk about his past the way other men his age did. There were no lists of things done, only a map in his eyes sometimes when music came on in the crew room, or when a certain weather pattern slouched in across the Atlantic. It was Evan who found the picture, in a frame kept simple, on a shelf near the kettle. Two winchmen, younger, the helicopter behind them, the world before them. Hawk on the right, taller by an inch, his arm around the shoulders of a man, with a grin that said the rules of gravity were optional. The caption was a date and two names, one of them Tom Tyres. Who was he? Evan asked, when Hawk came in and found him looking. Partner, Hawk said, filling a kettle. Friend. Too good at his job. What happened? Rope snapped. Weather, age, 1,000 little reasons that become one big one. He went into the water at night, and we didn't get him back. Took me a long time to stop hearing the sound of that cable flicking like a whip. Evan waited. Hawk's face was a shoreline, lines cut by weather and time. After that, Hawk said, and clicked the kettle onto its cradle, I learned that letting go isn't the same as dropping. We still do the job, we do it better, but we don't pretend we can hold everything. He poured, slid a mug across the counter. His hand brushed the frame, not quite touching it. You'll have a picture one day. You'll hate it and be glad you have it. Evan took the tea. I'm sorry. It was years ago, Hawk said. And then because he was not a man who lied to people he liked. And also yesterday. They were called to Lundy on a day the sky had edges. A tourist had fallen on the cliffs, a fractured pelvis, deteriorating. The air over the Bristol Channel was full of weather that looked like decisions. They tracked out low, the island a slate lump on steel water. The cliffs were a statement of geology and indifference. The casualty was on a ledge where gulls eyed him with proprietorial offense. Hawk went first because he always did when the calculus demanded it. Evan watched him in the harness. Lines neat, movements precise, the winch operator and pilot speaking to one another in that shorthand that belongs to teams. The rotor wash tried to argue with the cliff. The cliff did not care. Hawk landed beside the casualty like the idea of safety and went to work. It was medic work more than rope work, and Evan had the kit ready in his bag, flares of familiarity sparking in his mind. They packaged the patient for a strop lift, wind buffeting them, slips of rain like thrown gravel. Evan went down next to help, felt the helicopter above him as a living weight he trusted. The cliff smelled of salt and damp stone, his visor beaded with water, his breath loud in his mask. He and Hawk moved like they'd rehearsed, and they had. The casualty whimpered, when they moved him, then went quiet, which made Evan look twice at his face. "Stay with me," Asha would say, and he heard her voice and borrowed it. "Good man. In and out. We'll have you in the warm soon." The lift was awkward, the kind that ruins days if you get it wrong. They did not get it wrong. The patient rose and spun, and Evan braced the spin with a hand, like they'd taught him. Hawk followed, then Evan, and the cliff fell away, offended that they left. Back in the cabin, Hawk checked Evan's kit, like a father checking a seatbelt, then hit him on the shoulder with a light knuckle. "Nice," he said, which from Hawk was poetry. They handed the casualty to a waiting ambulance at Barnstaple, rotors never fully giving up, and were back over the channel when the pilot's voice came calm. "Pan pan, pan pan, fishing vessel, Morvoran reporting engine failure and taking on water. Position 8 miles northwest of Heartland Point. Lifeboat launching. We are the nearest helicopter." Hawk caught Evan's eyes. There was no drama in his face, only a ledger where columns had to add. "We're light on fuel," he said into the intercom. "We can give them 20, maybe 25 minutes before we have to find somewhere to sip." The weather thickened, as if in answer. The Morvoran was a small boat in a big place, its deck already slick. The RNLI boat was a streak of white water heading out, brave and late. They dropped fast, the winch operator muttering at the wind like it had cheated at cards. Hawk went down with the pump, because of course he did, Evan above him with lines and hands ready. The pump fought them, the sea fought them, the boat fought them, and still they got water out. Got the engine coughing live, got 3 men to look at one another like the world had just been remade. The lifeboat came on scene, gave them a grin of blue hull and a thumbs up, and the pilot said, with the patience Evan would always admire, "Gentlemen, we must go and see a man about kerosene." They lifted off and bent back to the coast, the helicopter aware of each drop of fuel, the sea aware of everything. Hawk laughed once, a short, breathless sound, and reached to steady Evan as a sway tried to argue with his feet. He did it like he had done it before, without thought, his hand a sure thing. "You're getting your hours," he said. "I'll take them," Evan said, and meant it. Dinner was curry in a small restaurant, where the owner called Asha Dr. Sahib, and brought extra pickle without being asked. The room was bright and clean, the tables close enough that conversations edited themselves. Outside, Truro was full of rain that would be weather by morning. Asha came off a 14-hour shift and still looked like a person who was awake in the world. Evan arrived early because he always arrived early and sat with his hands around a glass of water like a boy dressed as a man. They talked about families and places, about the Indian aunties who couldn't understand why Asha chose A and E when there were specialties with less blood and more prestige, about Evan's mum in Exeter who sent him parcels of biscuits and clippings of news whenever a helicopter appeared on the local page. They spoke about risk without calling it that, about the way you go to work when other people are going home. Asha told a story that made them both quiet for a moment, about a man who had come in with chest pain and left with a new life and a different way of eating. "Sometimes," she said, "I look down the corridor at 3 in the morning, and it's as if the building is a person holding its breath." Evan nodded. "Sometimes I look down a cable at 3 in the morning, and I think the same thing." She smiled, and it sat in his chest afterward, a small warmth that made other things easier. They took a walk along the river in light rain. Asha reached for his hand without ceremony, and he took it without flinching. The water was dark and unbothered. A late train sighed over the viaduct. A gust lifted the smell of wet leaves and diesel and bread from a bakery getting a head start. "I'm glad you asked me," she said. "Me too," he said, and tried to file the moment somewhere he could keep it. When they kissed, it was ordinary and astonishing, the way a storm sometimes is. Later, when he lay in his narrow bed at the base, the sound of a far door closing was like the sea turning in its sleep. The call that made Evan feel like a real winchman came on a night that started sour and got worse. A cold front heaved in on a low, the forecast making radio announcers sound pious. The shipping forecast had the cadence of prayer. Hawk stood with his hands on his hips, listening without looking like he was. The pages on the ops board weren't sticking properly, humidity making mischief. Fitzroy, gale 8, increasing severe gale 9. Rain, then squally showers, good, occasionally poor. Evan checked his kit twice, and then again, because the only thing worse than superstition is regret. The call was a sailing yacht dismasted 30 miles southwest, 2 souls aboard, 1 injured, engine uncertain. The RNLI boat from Newlyn was out, but the sea makes even distances close feel far. They were up and out in rain, like thrown beads. The yacht was a mangled thing on a black sea, aluminium spar twisted like a toy. The sailor with the injury had a head wound that wanted more time than the weather was giving. The other sailor was white around the mouth and moving like a person in shock. They were both clipped to the boat and talking too fast. Hawks spoke with them the way he spoke with the sea, not asking for favor, not pretending at control. "We're going to lift you," Hawk said. "This will feel wrong, and then it will feel right." Evan went down with the strop and the litter because 2 is smooth and 3 is a crowd, and tonight they had to be quick. Rain hammered his visor, water slapped his calves. The yacht's deck shifted under him like a living animal. He moved in the rhythm he had learned, with Hawk's hand on his shoulder, with Usher's voice in his ear, with the sea's old patience around him. They took the injured sailor first, packaged him, nodded at the winch operator, who was doing his own dance with wind and wire. The lift was clean. The second went up next, hands clenched around the strop like devotion. When Evan hooked his own line, Hawk gave him a brief pat, not quite a hug. His visor reflected a small version of Evan's face, eyes wide as a child at the top of a slide. "Good work," Hawk said, and the cable took Evan away. Back on board, they worked the injured man with warmed fluids and compressors, numbers climbing from the cellar. Evan spoke to him without noticing the words, his voice steady and ordinary, like you speak to a friend who is trying to remember the name of a song. Hawk gave him a look that said quietly, "You can do this," and Evan thought quietly back, "I am doing this." They handed the patient to Asha in A and E, where she met them with hair damp around her temples and a pen in her top pocket. She did not smile until the man's blood pressure found an address again. Then she gave Evan a small nod that sent a flare of something through him he would have been embarrassed to name. Later, when he and Hawk walked out into air that smelled of hot tarmac and wet leather, Hawk said, "You'll make senior one day." "I'll settle for making home," Evan said. Hawk's mouth twisted. That too. The summer was a rumor, and then a fact. The sea turned a different color for a while. Tourists provided a different set of emergencies. Evan and Asha learned the maths of 2 lives where the shift patterns needed a whiteboard. They crossed paths like trains and still found time. He met her mother on a video call where Mrs. Verma asked him questions like an interview panel, then smiled and said something in Gujarati that Asha translated as, He seems sensible. Tell him to keep his jacket zipped in the wind." Hawk watched it all with the compassion of a man who did not mind being alone because he knew what it cost to be otherwise. He had his own friends, the sort you accumulate when you've kept one another out of the sea. He took Evan to the pub now and then, to a place where the landlord had a face like a kind cliff and no-nonsense beer. He did not tell stories unless asked. When he did, they were about other men more than about himself. One afternoon, when there was no call and the maintenance was done and the kettle had done its work, Hawk took Evan out to the training tower. They practiced pivots and cable transfers. The wind was light, the sun a pale coin. At the top of the tower, looking west, the horizon made its straight line that is nothing like straight when you are in it. "What scares you?" Evan asked. Hawk thought a moment. "Not much now. I've used up most of the fears. I keep a few spare. Wires that look right and aren't. People trying to be brave when they need to be honest. Complacency. The days that feel easy, because that's when you forget to count." "And you?" he asked in return. "Letting someone down," Evan said, before he could tidy it. "Good," Hawk said. "That one keeps you sharp. Don't worship it." They watched a cloud throw a line of shadow across the water. A train slid along the far curve of the coast. Somewhere, a dog barked at something only dogs see. "You miss him," Evan said, without a question mark. "Every day," Hawk said, and then, because he was trying to give Evan something that was not a burden, but mostly in a way that makes me grateful, I had him. Grief is a tax on love. I don't mind paying. The storm did not arrive. It assembled, like men building a stage. It began with a pressure fall that made the air feel thin. Then the sky learned a new vocabulary and used all of it at once. The radio filled with traffic, the sort of steady clutter that tells you people are afraid. The barometer needle had a mind of its own. The forecast promised gales and then delivered more than promised. A cargo vessel, the Kestrel Sun, sent a mayday, fire in the engine room, then flood, then power lost. She was 55 miles southwest in a place the sea did not like sharing. The nearest ship altered course. The RNLI sent boats that would beat themselves to pieces getting there. The S-92 could make it, could hang and lift, could carry 4 at a time if they kept the weight right, could work until fuel drew a line under bravery. The aircraft bay was a machine of movement. The pilots did their calculations with unflustered faces. The winch operator checked and checked again. Hawk stood like a mast, steady in his suit, eyes on the windsock like a farmer judging hay. He glanced at Evan, took him in, nodded once. "This is a bad one," he said, in the tone most men used for talking about the weather. "Listen hard." "I'm with you," Evan said. "In the air," Hawk said, as they jogged for the aircraft. "Remember this. People will want to tell you the story of how they got here. Let them tell it later. Tonight, we are not historians. We are thieves. We are going to steal them from the sea." The helicopter clawed into the sky, heavy and eager. The air around them was a mess of water and wind. The pilots talked to the storm like it was a child who could be reasoned with. The Kestrel Sun was a lump on radar, a voice on the radio that tried not to sound scared. When they arrived, she was listing. Orange lights smeared by rain, men on deck in suits that made them look alike. "Deck's too wild for the litter," the winch operator said, clipped and calm. "Strops, quick as we can. We will be tight on fuel if we have to make 2 trips." "We'll take 4, Hawk said. "Evan, you'll ride the hook after the first pair and help load. We're not dancing tonight. We are counting. Speak clear, Move clean, breathe. They went down into a world that had narrowed to water and noise. The deck was a wet, heaving field of metal, square edges where none should be. Men grabbed at them. Hawk moved like a compass needle, finding north, put hands on shoulders, looked in eyes, made them trust. Evan followed him, did what he was shown, found his own hands being believed. They sent 2 men up, then Evan rose with the hook and dropped again, clipped 2 more, felt a wave go under him like the ground deciding to explain itself. Back in the cabin, bodies filled space and breath filled the rest. The winch operator's patter was less patter, more mathematics. The pilots brought them out and around into a circuit that threaded weather needles. Hawk came up last and dropped onto the deck with a thud that reverberated in Evan's bones. 4 aboard, the winch op said. We can lift again. Fuel says we do once more, then kiss somewhere friendly. The next pass, the storm got personal. The helicopter bucked. The deck slewed away so that even the horizon looked drunk. A container chain whipped and a man went down with a sound Evan felt more than heard. Hawk's hand was on him, hauled him back to the real task, the hook, the strop, the breath. They sent up another pair. Then Evan and Hawk were alone with 2 more men and the sea roaring its old song. Fuel, the pilot's voice warned. The calm cracked now. We must go on this one. Hawk looked at the last 2 sailors and then at Evan, and Evan knew the maths before Hawk said it. The helicopter could take 3 more. There were 4 souls on deck. Someone would have to wait. I'll stay, Hawk said, like he was choosing between apples. Get these 3 up. I'll ride the next aircraft, or the lifeboat if it beats you. No, Evan said, the word out of him like a cough. You will get in the helicopter, Pike, Hawk said, with a new voice, because you are the one I trained. Because you will be back in 20 minutes with a new plan. Because we are thieves, but we are also men with calendars. Do not argue. Count. Evan's mouth opened and closed, and then he was working, because the body knows when the brain doesn't. They strop-lifted the 2 remaining sailors one by one, and then Hawk put a hand on Evan's helmet and knocked it lightly with his knuckles, that same almost hug. And Evan said something like, please, but it was drowned by the sea. And then he was rising, and the deck was below him, and Hawk was smaller and then small. In the cabin, the 2 rescued men clung to the seats and each other. Evan reached for the intercom, voice thick. We'll go back. We'll go back if the numbers play nice, the pilot said, and did something violent but kind with the aircraft. Hold on to your breakfast. They ran for fuel. Land fell under them and then away. The storm chased but did not catch. The fuel Bowser man had the face of a saint. The pilots did sums that were also prayers. Evan fought his hands still. The winch operator said nothing, which is its own kind of speech. The rescued sailors murmured in a language of shock. They turned back. The 20 minutes Hawk had ordered stretched and snapped and joined again. Evan imagined the deck, imagined Hawk's face under the visor, imagined the way his hands would rest on the rail, loose, like a man waiting his turn. The radio was full, then empty, then a burst of bad news that was not theirs. When they reached the Kestrel sun, the deck was different in the way a face is different after a blow. Smoke licked from a vent. Rain flattened it. A container had moved like a piece on a board. The winch operator swore under his breath, which he never did. The deck was empty of people. Evan's stomach fell through him. They circled, found a life raft bright and obscene in the dark, three figures hunched inside it, and one man in the water near the stern, a shape that should have been a buoy, but was not. "Hawk," Evan said, and didn't know he'd said it until the intercom answered with silence. "Hold," the pilot said, voice a wire. "We've got one in the water and three in a raft. We can do both, but not at the same time." "Raft first," the winch operator said. "It's four up, then we are too heavy for fishing." "Water," Evan said, and had his harness on before he finished the word, the winch op looking at him with an expression that had all of his life in it. "Do it," the pilot said. "Be clean." They dropped Evan to the raft. Three faces looked up at him, terrified and furious at life. He clipped them fast. No talk, no story. He sent up two, then the third. By the time he was on the hook again, the man in the water had drifted. A wave reached up and shook Evan's thoughts out of order. He breathed, four in, four out, counted like an accountant in a storm. They found the body at last, not by sight, but by knowing where Hawk would be. He was near the stern because that gave the best chance if the raft fouled. He was where the cable could reach fast if it did. He was face up and eyes closed, and the sea was holding him like a son it wanted to keep. Evan went down, and the water swallowed him with the cold you get on bad days in life. He grabbed Hawk under the arms and felt the weight of a man who is finished with his own movement. He hooked them both, signaled. The cable took them, and the sea tried to argue, and the cable, and the pilot, and the winch operator, and the men who make machines, all said, politely but firmly, no. They laid Hawk on the deck, and Evan went to work with his hands and training and all the small hopes we have, like coins. The winch operator knelt with him, a hand on Hawk's forehead for a moment that was not medicine. The pilots flew like thieves. The storm yelled. Hawk did not come back. Asher's voice in Evan's head said, "Stop when you know. Don't stop because it hurts to stop." He stopped and bowed his head, and the sea roared in anyway. They carried him in like a king. The base crew stood and then moved, the pilots' faces older. Asher was there because what else do you do if someone you care about is hung between sky and ground? In the quiet room, she stood with Evan and put her hand on his arm and said nothing for a very long time. Someone made tea that no one drank. The picture by the kettle was not yet updated, but already heavier. Later, after the formalities and the kind lies you tell the living, Evan took Hawk's harness and hung it on the peg where it belonged. He smoothed the webbing once. He put his forehead against the cold of the metal hook and did not cry because the crying had done him in earlier, alone in a corridor where a mop watched. The next day, the base was full of flowers from people who do not know what else to do with love. The RNLI crew came and stood and nodded. The fishermen came in ones and twos, big hands, careful hats. A letter arrived from a man named Tom's mother, and another from a woman in Barnstaple who had been pulled up from a cliff. The kettle worked as always. The weather did what it wanted. Time did not heal, but it made room. The memorial was modest, because that is how Hawk would have had it. It was held in a boathouse, the smell of salt in the beams, gulls commenting. There was a board with photographs, where Hawk looked forever a little surprised to be in a picture. There was a rope coiled too neatly. There were mugs of tea that went cold in people's hands because they kept talking instead of drinking. Evan spoke when it was asked of him, which was when he had started to think he might escape the honor. He said the things you say, that Hawk had saved lives, that he had taught, that he had steadied other people's days. Then he told a story about landing on a boat in a squall and Hawk knocking his helmet with that strange, affectionate tap, and he found himself smiling because the memory overruled the ache. Asha stood with him afterward by the slip where a boat nosed at its painter. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, because no one ever says that love is not also practical. The sky was a clean blue that felt like theft after the past week. The sea lay with an innocence you learn not to hold against it. I keep thinking he's going to walk in with a joke we've heard, Evan said. He probably is, Asha said, just somewhere with better tea. They stood until the wind found its edge again. In the distance, a helicopter made its line across the sky, another crew on another shift, the moving day. Someone started to sing, quiet, and then stopped, because it wasn't that sort of day. A child ran down the slip and was scooped back by a worried aunt. Life kept the fan turning. On the first day, Evan wore the senior winchman's badge. He did not look in mirrors. The badge was not a costume. It was a sentence with weight. He ran the checks with the crew who had known Hawk longer than he had. He spoke in the tone he had learned, which was to say, in the tone of a man who was not trying to sound like anyone else. The weather was fair. The calls were unremarkable. He breathed and counted and made tea, where Hawk had made tea. In the hospital corridor that evening, Asha took his hand and pressed something into his palm. It was a small piece of knotted cord, the sort Hawk used to show a bend, the ends sealed with heat. He used it to explain lines to some kid who came to the open day, she said. The kid kept it, then brought it back with his mum when he heard. Said he thought it belonged here more than in a drawer. The mum cried in the lobby. I took it before anyone could file it. Evan held the knot. It was a simple figure 8, done neat. He looped it through his key ring, and the weight of it was both nothing and precisely what he could carry. That night, the shipping forecast hummed through the base. It was habit by now, a quiet blessing. Evan stood by the window and looked at the runway and the sea beyond it. He heard the words without trying to remember them. Lundy, Fastnet, Irish Sea, westerly backing southerly, 4 or 5, occasionally 6 at first, rain at times, good, occasionally poor. He said aloud to the room and the picture by the kettle and the hook on the wall, we're listening. The call came at 2:17. As calls like to, they moved. The helicopter did its relent. The air outside was honest and cold. The sea was old and not unkind. Evan clipped his harness, checked the hook, knocked the helmet of the new lad on his shoulder with his knuckles, once, lightly. Breathe, he said. 4 in, 4 out. Count. Nobody's keeping score. He went out into the night, and the rotor wash found him. He felt for a moment like a thread in a very large weave. In his head, as the cable paid out and the water rose to meet him, a voice that was not a ghost and not his own spoke calmly with him, counted with him, kept him steady. Later, when the patient was asleep on warmed blankets and the helicopter turned for home, Evan looked out at the seam where black water met blacker sky. He thought about how memory is not a picture, but a weight, something you can pass from palm to palm to remind yourself you have hands. He thought about Asha, asleep in the 2 hours she had before dawn, about the boy on the cliff, about the men from the Kestrel sun, about Hawk in the water, as if the sea had simply decided it needed him back for a while. He did not pray. He did not need to. The engines sang the song. They always sang. The pilot's voice was a constant. The winch operator whistled tunelessly under his breath. Evan breathed. He counted. He went home. There is a superstition on some boats where they carve a name under the rail of a man who has gone over, so the boat remembers and does not take another in the same fashion. At the base, someone carved a small hawk under the lip of the bench in the crew room, near the kettle, neat as a signature, tucked where only those who knew would notice. It caught on sleeves now and then, a reminder that touched without showing off. Months later, a school tour came through, children with questions like hailstones. Evan showed them the harness, the cable, the helmet. He told them about respect, about breathing. He did not tell them about grief, because grief is not for tours. A boy with a scab on his chin asked if he ever got scared. Yes, Evan said. What do you do? The boy asked, eyes wide with the bravery of those who haven't needed it yet. I count, Evan said, and I remember that I am not alone. After they left, the base returned to its soft waiting. The weather put a hand on the door and then took it away. Asha texted to say she had a late finish, but could bring curry. The knot on Evan's keys caught the light when he turned to go and made a small shadow in the shape of a figure 8, a loop that brings a rope back to itself. He touched it without thinking. A habit now, a yes. When he walked past the picture by the kettle, he stopped and looked, like he always did. Hawk's grin had not faded. Tom Tyres's too. The faces were what the sea had left them, and what the people who loved them had kept. Evan lifted the kettle, filled it, clicked it down. He did not speak aloud because some things are bigger than words, but if he had, it would have been what Hawk had said when he taught him the first rules. Respect, not bravado. Visitors, not owners. Count, not boast. Steal the living from the sea, then go home. Outside, the wind picked up, and the day assembled itself, and somewhere west, a boat sent a message into the air, and the men and women at the base stood up and went to work. A small defiance against a large world, a thin, bright line across an old, dark water. And in that work, in that movement, in the way a hand reaches to steady another without fuss, a man named Mark Hawkins kept living. Not as a story with a sad end, but as a voice in the headset, and a weight on the shoulder, and a knock on a helmet. Gentle, once, like a promise.